there's some things, specific things that you asked for, and that's a discussion of what's going on in Venezuela. And here, I think it's going to be really important to recognize a couple of things. The Trump administration is once again insisting that this is about drugs. It is not about drugs. This is, again, an attempt to take people of color and label them, for Americans who are not paying terribly close attention, as bad guys. They're drug dealers, they're murderers, they're rapists. How many times have you heard that? And the same thing is true with these immigration sweeps, where it turns out the vast majority of the people they're sweeping up have not been convicted of crimes. This is an attempt on the part of people like White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller to get rid of people who are not white in the United States, and that's a whole different story that is thoroughly anti-American. But they're not going after drug dealers, and you know this for a couple of reasons. If you listen especially to White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt, she talks about drugs, and then she switches right into talking about illicit fentanyl. But in fact, the boats that they are striking primarily in the Caribbean come from Venezuela, or at least they allegedly come from Venezuela. And Venezuela, the traffickers, drug traffickers out of that region of the world, first of all, mostly use the Eastern Pacific. All right. So if you look at a map, you see they mostly use the Eastern Pacific. Venezuela does not produce fentanyl. In fact, Mexico produces fentanyl, and it comes into the United States in a different way. The countries that produce cocaine. The argument is that these Venezuelans are producing these drugs that are killing Americans, and they're implying that that's fentanyl. But in fact, these boats, if they are carrying drugs, are almost certainly carrying cocaine. Cocaine does not come from Venezuela primarily. Cocaine comes from Colombia and Ecuador. So hitting these boats, which are small boats that are almost 1,000 miles from the United States border, is going to do absolutely nothing to actually address issues of fentanyl. And those boats are almost certainly not headed for the United States. They are probably headed elsewhere. So if that's the case, what is going on here? And I think there are a couple of things going on, and I don't think you can discount one of them, which is this idea coming out of the United States, and this thing that this ideological construct I just described, that some people are better than others. And the image of that was always the American cowboy. We're going to hit first and we're going to think later because we're the guys who really understand how to do things. We're better than everybody else. We're just going to flex our muscles. And you see that I think in a really big way with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who's made it clear he believes that the laws of war, for example, or the Geneva Conventions are wussy, that you can't really fight a war unless you just can do anything to your opponents. And I have to say, it's a bit of a digression, but there was a man in my profession, a historian, who had been an interrogator in World War II. And really interesting because he was dead set against this whole torture stuff, this whole we're going to flex our muscle stuff, because he said the way you got information out of the Nazis was you got them to trust you over things like playing chess or something. And I'm going to make this part up. You would say something like you'd play chess for a while and you'd make a move. And I forget who the guy was that he got information out of, but he said, and he'd laugh and he'd say, oh, my son did that once. So you'd know he had a son, and you'd know his son played chess, and just things like that, that's how you extracted information. It was an intelligence game. It was not I'm going to hurt you so badly, you're going to say whatever I tell you to. Well, this idea that we're going to throw the first system out and resort to this, swaggering, I'm going to inflict harm system is, I think, at least in part what we're seeing with this idea, we're simply going to blow people out of the water rather than stop those boats and take those people back to the justice system where they can be interrogated, among other things, which is what we've always done in the past. And one of the things that we have done by blowing these people out of the water is we have made Colombia, which had been very cooperative in trying to stop shipments to the United States, stop sharing any information with us. So that's not helping, right? You also know this is not about drugs because of the fact that Trump just pardoned a convicted drug dealer in the United States who had been bringing lots of cocaine into the United States. Trump just pardoned him, and he's pardoned two other major drug dealers as well, including Ross Ulbricht, who was the guy who came up with the Silk Road dark web. So you know it's not about the drugs. It's partly about flexing muscles, but it's also about something else. And this is the piece that I'm watching in a way that that I may be wrong, absolutely may be wrong. But I'm really interested in it because it certainly seems to me as if the Trump administration is throwing overboard the post World War II idea that America needed alliances, that the way you kept Americans safe, which you can never forget, is the primary reason that we have governments, to keep us safe. We tend to forget that in the United States because we have been so safe. But that's why you institute governments in the first place. And then you does other stuff as well, but that's number one. And after World War II, there was this idea that you created safety for nations, first of all, by sharing intelligence. I talked to Senator Mark Warner from the Intelligence Committee this morning. It's recorded on YouTube and here on Facebook. It was really very interesting about what he had to say about the intelligence communities. So you share intelligence and you also develop peacetime. That's really important. Peacetime treaties, defensive treaties, so that, for example, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is the organization where countries say, we're all banded together, you especially Russia, but other countries as well. So if you think you're going to whack one country, you just so you know, we're all coming for you. You hit any one of us, we're all going to come and hit you. And as a result, those NATO countries don't get hit, or they haven't in the past. Now that Trump is pulling back from them, you're seeing Russians wiggle into places. They just blew up a train line in Poland. It's a NATO country. And there were just a couple of drone attacks on a plane that Volodymyr Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, was in today. You're seeing them creating trouble in other NATO countries, clearly pushing the envelope to see whether or not the United States and other NATO countries will step up. So I think you see Trump backing away from that and putting in place something different. And that something different appears to be from a speech that Marco Rubio gave shortly after Trump took office, Marco Rubio now being the Secretary of State, an emphasis on what they call the Western Hemisphere. They seem to be deciding that the United States should control the North America, which explains some of their hostility toward Canada, like one of our best friends, Canada. I mean, Canada tracks Santa Claus, right? And Greenland, and which is a Danish related nation, island nation. You see that, and you also see them really putting pressure on a number of different countries in South America. So not just, although we're all paying attention to Venezuela right now, where the leader Maduro is not a good guy, but you also saw Trump bailing out Argentinian President Javier Milei to the tune of at least 20 billion with a B dollars, and quite likely much more than that. There was also another major payment and a backstop set of loans to make sure that he got reelected. And we have played around in another election recently. And of course, one of the drug dealers that Trump just pardoned was the former president of Honduras, whose party is running for reelection as well. And it certainly looks as if the real pressure that Trump is trying to put in Venezuela is not really about drugs. It's about trying to create enough pressure on Maduro with the idea that the United States might go in and do land hits as well, that they will overthrow him and put in place a government that is amenable or more amenable to American investment in that country, including, you know where this is going, into its oil. That idea of reorganizing the world, the globe, along the idea of spheres of influence is one very much embraced by Vladimir Putin of Russia. But what it also does is it takes us back again to a world that looks very much, by the way, we're in a wicked windstorm here. I might lose connection. But it takes us back to a world of the 1890s, the 1900s, a period when a very few people ran the United States of America. And the United States of America wasn't really interested in the world at that point. So there isn't really a parallel there to the way America was reacting to the rest of the world. But it takes us back to an idea really before we had a government that was based in the idea of democracy, in the idea of democratic movements, and in the idea of alliances that could protect us around the world.